Do you remember this show? Chock Socky Chooks ran from 2008 to 2010. It followed three chicken things that didn't really look like anything in particular besides ugly, where they lived inside this city-sized mall that the villain owned for some reason, because that makes sense. And I'm legitimately disappointed to find out that Aardman Animation had something to do with this, because I quite liked them, and the show was, horrifying at best. The characters were Ko Joe, which was this sort of comic relief type of character, and then there was Chuckle-chan, who was like this weird, serious sort of character, and then there was Chickpea, who was girl. I think I remember the villains being based on Asian food, and when I looked them up, I was only really interested in reading like 5 pages before I just didn't get interested anymore, and I think the main villain's name was Wasabi or something. It was one of the ugliest shows that I had ever seen. At the time when it was first airing, 2008, I was 9, and I only really remember getting cartoons from Cartoon Network. I also remember having a flash drive given to me by my uncle, I think, that had Happy Tree Friends on it. We'll go talk about that some other time. I was, for some reason, interested enough to keep watching, and the show itself, even though I talk about how horrifying it is and all that, it honestly wasn't. I mean, it's not something that a kid would be scared by, it would just be more confused, I guess. That was kind of what I felt at the time, but I figured, hey, cartoon, might as well watch it. However, at this point, and a little while after that fact, I was only kind of just realizing that I kind of liked being scared by horror stuff. And I was also really liking music and stuff. And I'm one of those people who kind of ended up becoming kind of the opposite of what they were when they were a kid in some aspects. For instance, I was actually really easily scared by horror stuff back then in certain cases, I guess, but now I'm just too desensitized from it because I watch it all the time. I just don't really care. And the reason that I'm saying all of this is, I guess, for possible explanations for why this show scarred me for life, as the title says. Because honestly, in comparison to everything else that could have scared me, I don't really understand how this would fit in. It's like the difference between Courage the Cowardly Dog and Ed, Edd n Eddy. Courage the Cowardly Dog did actually have elements that, understandably, it would scare you. A lot of people are scared by the "you're not perfect" thing. I mean, just by mentioning that, I've made a couple of you go, oh my god, no, right? But then with Ed, Edd n Eddy, it's like, is there really anything to be scared about? Because it was such a, I guess, cartoony cartoon that it never really went anywhere that was considered creepy. At least not from what I remember. So it's kind of like the distinction between finding something that was creepy in a show that had creepy things and just finding a really ordinary or lighthearted good show that I don't understand where the creepy stuff came from. The only real creepy stuff comes from the stupid creepypasta theories that don't make any sense. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Now we're gonna kind of talk about nightmares. So this is really where the whole scarring thing comes in. I guess when you're little, nightmares have a lot of power. They're just random, you don't really understand what's going on, and then as you get older, only very specific things that feed off very specific parts of your life or things that happened are going to make you scared of things, concerning nightmares anyway. So I guess before that point when I was 9, all the dreams that I had were just kind of random and weird. As I said, there wasn't really any connection, and they also weren't really that vivid. The nightmares mainly just involved me going, oh, look, there's a fucking monster in the closet. Oh, I woke up. And that was it. And I had no idea what a recurring dream was. I'd never had it before. So that's weirdly how Chooks comes in. I'm just gonna call it Chooks because I feel like if I keep trying to say that name really fast, I'm gonna end up hurting myself. So I would watch this really bland, weird show and I wouldn't care, and then all of a sudden I had this weird nightmare, and for some reason I could never watch the show again. I even buried it in my memory. The only reason that I even remember the show is because I was watching a Rebel Taxi video about obscure cartoons and things, and he wasn't even the one who mentioned it. It was somebody else in the comments who was making their own list about it because of something he said. So I saw the name and I'm like, why do I feel kind of scared when I think about this? It's probably one of those little kid things where I got scared of it for no reason. And then when I looked it up eventually, I just kind of remembered everything. So I guess the best way to explain why the nightmare and everything about that was so important in contrast to other ones and other things that scared me as a kid, I will have to explain the nightmare. Now remember, Chooks took place in a giant city-sized mall. I don't think anything was under like a giant dome or something, it was kind of just out there. And it was kind of like Sydney, but everywhere's a shop, like there's no opera house or anything, everywhere's just a shop. Not the best place on the Citadel. So for some reason in my dream, there was this weird kind of filter over the city. Everything was kind of broken, really, and there was this weird blue sort of almost purple at times, but very dark and grainy sort of filter. Almost as if I was kind of layering different filters on top of it, and it was very constant. You know how when Not really like in movies or in videos where you lay the filter and it clearly just looks like you put a filter over it. In this one, it just seemed like everything else had a filter on it. Like each building that I would touch had this thin film around it where the filter was on it, but then in the air itself it wasn't really there. It's kind of weird to explain. And the other two characters were there, other than the girl character, and they were just really quiet and their heads were a lot bigger for some reason, and they never said anything. And they just kind of walked around with me. So I was like, hey, I must be Chickpea. And I wasn't, but we'll get to that. So we just kind of walked around this weird place for a while, and then nothing really happened, and I just got really creeped out, but because the dream, even though it felt both fast and slow at the same time. It just felt like this walk was taking way too long, but at the same time I was just going through so much time at once that I was losing all of this time and I couldn't do something or whatever. And it was one of the first times that I felt that in a dream, so you could say that that was one of the things that freaked me out the most. So then we enter one of the buildings, and then we start going down, and we go down escalators and everything, and it gets darker as we go down, but it also starts changing colour. It starts going this weird kind of, whichever way you pronounce it, sepia or sepia, and it just keeps going darker and more kind of orangey sepia sort of colour, and it looks a bit like candlelight, but it's also just over everything, so it's not really consistent with candlelight being in a particular little bunch next to the candle. So then suddenly, for some reason, we're in this weird catacomb type area, and everything is just like a mine shaft, like those weird wooden structures with they go up the sides and then has the thing across the roof and then it keeps repeating downward like that kind of mineshaft thing. So it's just that everywhere. And then we keep walking through them and it gets even quieter and it's just too quiet. Like I can't even hear footsteps or anything at this point, it's just quiet. And throughout this point, as we kept going down, there was this really constant weird rumbling noise that was the only noise that was going on. I don't really know how to describe it. If I find a noise that's accurate to that, I'll be playing it in the background right now, but that sort of thing just went on, and for some reason, that's one of the things that makes me most uncomfortable in movies nowadays, the rumbling noises. So then this kept going, and eventually we stopped at this dead end sort of thing, and I couldn't see what was at the very end. So I kept walking, and then I saw this weird minecart, and Chickpea was lying in it with her back to us, and she had the same sort of film over her, but it was more like a soapy film, because I could see like this white texture, and I didn't really know what it was. It was like an egg membrane, if that makes sense. And then she starts slowly turning around, like not her specifically, but the minecart starts turning around as if she's doing it. And I didn't really have a concept to understand this at the time, and I didn't really pick up on it, but I'm pretty sure she was dead, because it kind of sounds like she was. And then right as she was about to turn around, the other characters had started walking towards the minecart to like get in as well, I don't know why, but then I was just kind of zoomed out and pulled back, and then I felt this weird sensation like I was like becoming part of the mine for some reason. I have no idea why. But then it just ends like that, and I wake up, and it's not like other dreams where I get scared for the rest of the night. This one lingered in my mind for the entire day, and then the day afterwards as well, which I never had before because even back then nightmares hadn't really bothered me as much, so it was just weird for this to happen. Now we're gonna obviously move on to why that was such a big deal. So this pretty much set up this weird criteria for dreams that I would have every couple years, and I haven't really had one in a while, so I guess they stopped, but it would take something in my environment or a book or a movie or something that I had, and it would take all of those landscapes and kind of mash them together and present that sort of same distorted version of it, like the weird film around all of the buildings, the same colors, not necessarily like a mine shaft or anything, but just stuff that kind of came in the same, I guess, theme. And then all of the characters would just have something weird happen to them, and then at the end I would be absorbed into the landscape or have something that would happen to me as well, and it was this kind of finality to it as well, like you're just someone who has seen this and gone through the same thing and you're just dead now. And I would wake up like that. And no, I have no idea. To give you another example, I ended up watching Coraline the first time that it came out, which is, I can't remember how old I was, but I was a couple years older. I think I was like 10 or 11 or something at this point, and at the time I had no idea who Neil Gaiman was. I wasn't really into reading as much as I am now, and I hadn't read the book. I didn't even know it was a book. I had never heard of this concept before. I had this weird dream after I got home, and it was like the sort of same thing, except it was set in that mansion house thing that Coraline is set in the movies. And then for some reason, the characters were like shrinking and turning into like weird dried little things, like not quite shrunken heads, but kind of like shrunken everything, and like a shrunken head and a shrunken body kind of put into the fetal position. I don't know why. And then at the end of it, because I was just walking through the house in first person, and then I got to that tunnel you have to crawl through, and I, for some reason, turned into the same thing and went into the wall. And that was just something that happened, and as I got older, it was the same dream, except instead of really hanging on to TV shows or movie settings, it just hung on to different parts of stuff that was going on at the time, or concept. As you get older, dreams kind of become sort of different in what they're portraying and what fears really mean, I guess, if that makes sense of what I said earlier. And you know, obviously now I'm not really scared of it at all, I just don't really give a shit. Like with most nightmares, I might get startled when I wake up because of a jump scare or something, but then afterwards I just don't really give a shit. And like 5 seconds later, I'm just fine and I just go back to bed, or I just wake up, depending on what time it is. But the big deal was I'd never had a dream like that before in my life at that point. And that's one of the reasons why I remember it so vividly, because I'd never had one of those. It was so strange. And I don't know why I was connected to that show. That show had no horror themes whatsoever. It was not remarkable in any way whatsoever. And I think that even if I didn't have a horror kind of dream experience that I'd made myself forget when I was little, I still would have forgotten about the show because it just wasn't interesting. I'm not saying that it's like really bad, but it just wasn't really anything special. And I guess that's really my main thing. Also, I remembered this a little while ago when I was kind of going through everything in my head. I didn't even watch Chooks that day. I don't think so. I remember it being on at a very specific time, or I recorded it to watch it at a very specific day because that was just the day that I marathon cartoons or something. I think that was some sort of structure that maybe my parents set up or something. And I remember not really watching that cartoon because I remember the next day it wasn't really on either, and then afterwards I would just avoid it every time it was on, and I would specifically put the channel on silent when I went into Cartoon Network and then read the name, and so that I don't know why, it just made me feel better because I wouldn't really have to hear the vocals of it or anything, so I could just move on if it was on and just forget it existed. I have no idea why I did that, but it was honestly one of the weirdest things ever. And this is coming from somebody who, as I said before, is obsessed with horror stuff. I would have probably loved it if there was a horror thing inside that show, and maybe I would have still had the nightmare prompted by that, but it was just weird how that happened. Because I'd never really had a dream based on Courage the Cowardly Dog, and I got really scared with some of those episodes, and it just, for some reason, never really went into dreams. I also remember I had dreams about shows and things, but it never really transferred into nightmares, and if it did, the nightmares weren't memorable. I didn't give a shit. And that was one of the first times that a show really got to me in that way, even though it had nothing to do with the show. I honestly have no idea where I'm going with this. So that's why I thought, one, kind of conceptualizing it in the way that I did with the title was really interesting, and two, the comparisons between different types of shows is kind of interesting as well, because it's just really weird how something like that can kind of impact you in a certain way that it doesn't intend to whatsoever. And I think it's really interesting as well to do with the whole lost episode creepypasta sort of thing, and how it's not really a new concept. It was just something that people had never really put forward in this particular way, or this particular iteration of horror, like internet horror, as something like that before. If I was 12 right now instead of 19, I would have probably put that on Creepypasta Wiki and it would have been terrible. Because that's what it sounds like. I know that's what it sounds like. I know it sounds like this weird creepypasta thing, which is really my point here. I think that a lot of the lost episodes things are just weird dream sequences that people had when they were kids and they had no idea what was going on. And they decided that it was somehow worthy to make into a legitimate creepypasta instead of a funny story that people just tell. And part of me doesn't really like where the trend is going with that, because I just don't really appreciate it too much. It just seems like a really lazy thing to do, to just go, here's a show, but if we put blood in it, or if we make it creepy and we write it down, that's not a story. I don't really get it. I never really liked it. Maybe because I had the dream like that before and I knew that it wasn't really connected and it didn't scare me. I honestly would have enjoyed the stories a lot more if people just put them in as dream sequences, and I hope that this isn't something that becomes a really big thing. I hope that it kind of peters off when people realize that. It kind of reminds me of the thing with the SCP website, how people at first were like, hey, you can submit your stories, but then they started cracking down on the moderation because they realized that people were just putting in stupid stuff that doesn't make any sense. I kind of wish that people would kind of come along and do that, but at the same time, but for like a different thing, because I want people to be able to publish the stories that they want to on their platforms, but I also want something moderated that I can actually go and enjoy and not feel like I'm stepping into cancer shit. So yeah, this was a really weird and overly drawn out story that I did not think would take me this long to talk about. I am surprised at the length of the video. Honestly, I was expecting it to be about 5 minutes. I also, because of that, just got a bunch of different memories about stuff that did scare me as a kid that wasn't meant to as well. Kind of like the YMS childhood trauma thing. And I figured I might do some videos on that as well because I never did at the time, and I think that now I might have some time to because I actually have something interesting to talk about. So yeah, I'm kind of interested to see how many of you actually remembered the show as well, because I honestly don't really remember which demographics it was really targeted to the most, and across like what countries or whatever it was. I know it was an American show, which is weird because it used the word chooks, which means chicken, that we use here, but I have never heard Americans use it, and the times that I have told American people about the show, they're like, what is chook? Altogether, the show was weird. I have no idea why Aardman Animation would bother going into it, but hey. If you have any weird stories about this sort of stuff as well, put them in the comments, because I actually kind of want to do a narration compilation of them where I just read them out like that. I think that would be kind of interesting. That's up to you though. Around 11 last night was when I was watching the Rebel Taxi video, and then I started searching up stuff about chooks, and I ended up staying up for the whole night and going to bed at 5 AM, and it's around midday now, I think, so I look like shit and I'm probably rambling way too much, but there you go.